Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful summer evening. I'm going to start with a little story about something that happened to me in the United States, but I think you'll find it relatable. I was in Portland, Oregon. I was driving across town, and I could see at the end of the street this beautiful 19th century church with a great big steeple, freshly painted white. And as I got closer, I could see there was a marquee out front. And on the marquee, in big letters, it said, "This is not a church." And I thought, well, perhaps someone had come in expecting to find a place to worship or a place to find some quiet spiritual time, and then been disappointed to discover that it was now a performing arts center. And then I thought, you wouldn't put a marquee out front for one person. This must have happened multiple times. And my point is, spiritual yearning, a desire for spiritual understanding, it's something that is natural to all of us. It's built in. Doesn't matter who you are or where you live or what your background is, that yearning is there. And that really is at the heart of what I'll be talking about tonight, because some years ago, I had a spiritual experience. Well, this experience disrupted everything I thought I knew about how life works. It made me aware very suddenly that there was a completely different way to think. And because of it, as Stephen said, I was healed overnight of numerous physical problems. And it was Christian Science that made sense of what had happened to me by showing me that Jesus' teaching, that God is love, unconditional, always present, all-powerful love, that teaching is practical. It's provable. It is, in a word, scientific. Now, as you might imagine, my first response was relief. It was wonderful to be well after years of illness. But bigger than that feeling was this sensation of hope because of the implications of what had happened. I thought if just catching a glimpse of the reality of this love could have such a profound effect on me, well, then it could on anybody. Now, Albert Einstein said a new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move toward higher levels. The kind of thinking that I'll be talking about tonight does that by giving us a dependable way to find love's presence and that practical goodness. So as you might have seen, the title of this talk is Finding Where God is Seen and Felt. And that grew out of my experience. And then there's a little subtitle, What's Church Got to Do with It? And I hope to show you that those two things go together, that in fact, they're inseparable. Because whenever, wherever you start from the premise of love's presence, you are going to find love's healing and transforming power. And then, whenever, wherever you live in accord with that love, you live in response to it, you become part of the church that Jesus and the early Christians talked about. Not a bricks and mortar location, but a response to God's goodness that includes all of us. So it's these two things. It's that recognition of the reality of always present, all-powerful love, and our response to it that will enable us to survive and move toward those very much needed higher levels. Now, when I was a child, God's goodness was very real to me. It was as real as the air that I breathed. Jesus was known for saying that little children with their love of good, their trust in good, that they are closer to the kingdom of heaven, closer to God than adults who come with their opinions and their biases and their fears. And I think this tells us something about who we all really are, what our relationship to God, to good, is. Our love of good is innate, it's built in. We all want good for ourselves. We want it for the people we care about. If it's not there, we feel like something's wrong. And it is this built-in love of good that welcomes that larger love of God, that makes it possible for that love to reach us, even in difficult conditions. Now, I grew up in the Christian Science church, and the things my mother told me, the things I learned in Sunday school, all just affirmed that built-in sense of good. So I was taught that God is divine, supreme, incorporeal, infinite. Some big words for a small child. But to me, they just meant God is entirely good. That goodness is the biggest thing there is. It doesn't depend upon material conditions, and it's everywhere all the time. And then in Sunday school, I was also taught different names, synonyms for God that helped me see the entireness of this goodness. So I was taught that God is principle, the foundation, the structure of everything. That God is mind, soul, and spirit, which are terms associated with God in the Bible. And I think that those are words that help us connect to what is most important to us humanly. Intelligence, understanding, wisdom, creativity, the ability to recognize good and walk that way, inspiration. I was taught that God is life, life itself, that God is truth, reality itself, and that God is, as Jesus taught, love. So putting these things together, putting together, for example, that mind is divine, helped me to see that what God knows is entirely good. The Bible says he is of purer eyes than to behold evil. God knows no evil. Mind is divine. That mind is supreme helped me to see that what God knows is going to be the final word. That mind is incorporeal and infinite, assured me there was no place I would ever find myself where that divine intelligence was not going to be present and active. Now, I don't think I fully grasped the logical conclusion that those ideas led to. That what they point to is that there really is just one primary cause. And because of that, there can't be an effect from any other cause. I think I experienced these ideas as sort of flashes of reality that felt like coming home. And that's what prayer was. It wasn't asking God to take away a problem. It was thinking specifically about what God is and what God is doing right there in real time. And if there was some needful good that was missing, safety or well-being, well, then I could know that was a seeming. Because in fact, life's goodness, love's presence and power, truth's authority, were right there. And when I would do that, whatever the seeming was would disappear. So when I was very small, I used to get earaches every time I went swimming. And one evening in the midst of a painful episode of this, I remembered something I'd been told in Sunday school, which was that God fills all space. And I thought, that has to include the space where my ears are. And just with that little revelation of divine truth, the pain went away. Well, those earaches never came back. A few years later, I was in a car with my mother. We were on our way to a doctor to get me checked into a hospital to have my tonsils out. I'd been missing a lot of school because of sore throats, and some of my friends had had their tonsils out, and my father, who was not a Christian Scientist, thought this might be a good idea. So we were about a block from the doctor. My mother turns to me and she says, "What God knows about you is all there is to know." And it was like a light bulb went on over my head. Because up to that moment, I had not been praying in the way that I've been describing to you. I'd mostly been hoping the whole problem would just go away by itself, despite promises of post-operative ice cream. But in that moment, I knew what she had said was true. And now, looking back on that moment, I know she hadn't just been driving me to the doctor, she'd been sitting there praying. And that was the thought that had come to her in prayer. So we went into the office and the doctor looked at me and said, "These tonsils are perfect. There's no reason to take them out. Go home." Mm-hmm. And as we were going out the door, I heard him say to my mother, "You've been practicing your religion again, haven't you?" A few years after that, I was up in the middle of the night feeling a desperate need to pray. I thought, I'll start with the Lord's Prayer, that prayer Jesus taught his followers that begins, "Our Father," meaning God. And I didn't get past those first two words because what they made me suddenly see was that not only did they mean that I was God's child, loved, cared for, protected, but that the group of kids at my school who had promised to beat me up the next day, they were also God's beloved children. That was not a thought I had had about them previously. But in that moment of seeing that, the fear drained away. I went to school the next day. I did not get beat up. In fact, the bullying that had been going on for weeks just stopped as if it had never happened. Praying this way felt normal. It felt joyful when I did it. Again, I don't think I grasped what you might call the theological implications, that it was the very nature of God that assured my safety and well-being. I just knew when I made room in my thought for a God who was love, it felt like coming home, and healing followed. But as I got into my late teens, God was getting crowded out of my thought by what I read in the morning newspaper, what I was learning at school, history, what I talked about with my friends, what I saw in the evening news when I went home. And I was finding it hard to reconcile those things with the idea of a God who is omnipresent good, omnipotent good. And it was around this time a friend had come over and he was talking about his becoming disaffected with religion. He said, I can't buy it. What kind of God would allow the war and the corruption in politics and the misery, the poverty, the disease that you see all around the world? What kind of God would allow that? And how could you call that God good? Why would you worship that God? And in that moment, I did not have a good answer for him because I was as impressed by those things as he was. Now, if I had been able to hit pause in that moment. And picked up this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. This is the textbook of Christian Science. This is the book that Mary Baker Eddy, the woman who discovered and founded Christian Science, wrote. All I would have had to do is go to the first page. First page of the preface would have given me something, would have helped me answer my friend's question. It also would have saved me years of trouble. Right there at the second paragraph, it begins, "The time for thinkers has come." And I think that would have hooked me. At 17, I thought of myself as a really good thinker. It's okay to laugh here. It goes on, "Truth, independent of doctrines and time-honored systems, knocks at the portal of humanity." And it would have done me good in that moment to remember that there is such a thing as divine truth. I could have turned there for inspiration, for understanding, instead of going round and round with those time-honored systems, those doctrines that weren't producing anything good. It continues, "Contentment with the past and the cold conventionality of materialism are crumbling away. Ignorance of God is no longer the stepping stone to faith." Well, at that point, faith was pretty much off my radar. I think I was definitely theologically ignorant. Because what had happened was I had, without even realizing it, just accepted the cold conventionality of materialism. I was like a fish who's swimming along and another fish calls out, "Hey, how's the water?" And I would have said, "What's water?" I was just going with the flow without even knowing I was doing it. So when I got to college, I stopped going to church. I dismissed it as something I'd outgrown. But what I could not dismiss were those healings. And there were many more of them than the ones I just shared with you. If God had not been the cause of those experiences, well, I wanted to know what was. And so I signed up for courses at my university that I thought might answer those questions. But nothing that I found in my psychology classes, my philosophy classes, gave me answers that really rang true with my own experience. So as time went on and life got more complicated, as it does, I started asking more questions, life's big questions. Like, what is really going on here? Who am I? What am I here for? And I started looking into different religions and different spiritual practices, seeking answers. 15 years in the meditation hall certainly brought moments of calm, but not answers to those questions and not a lasting sense of peace. I used to marvel at the fact that I could spend 3 hours on my zafu and get so calm and so centered. And then I would drive down to town and someone would cut me off for a spot in the supermarket parking lot, and where did that calm and peace go? So I headed into my 30s with a lot of unanswered questions, and at that point also an array of medical problems that were defying medical solutions. As you heard, I'd been diagnosed with something called endometriosis, and doctors told me it was so pervasive I would never have children. I had migraines that would put me in a dark room for days. I had back problems, and I had this chronic pain that moved around my body. And when I asked a doctor about it, I said, "Where is it coming from? What's the source of this pain?" And he said, No, this pain has no source. This is phantom pain. Phantom pain. He said, "The man that figures out what this is will get his name on a plaque in a medical school." And I think it was around this time I began investigating alternative medicine, and I tried acupuncture and Chinese herbs and homeopathy, and I did yoga, and pretty much if you've heard of it, I tried it. But I wasn't finding any relief. And I'd had a surgery that had not helped. And then that summer, I contracted what the ER doctor told me kind of excitedly was a rare strain of malaria. I had no idea where I could have gotten it. They sent off samples to the CDC in Georgia, and there was no treatment. So now on top of everything else, I have a fever that never breaks. 24/7. It's going into its 4th week. And I feel like my life as I've known it has ended. Because now all I can do, I can sit up in bed and read a little. On a good day, I might make it out to the couch in the living room. I can remember sitting there one afternoon just weeping in frustration at what my life had become. And it was around this time that I found myself awake in the night, and I think the fever had dipped a little, and I was thinking about some books that I'd been trying to read on quantum physics, because I was still searching. One of the books had used this phrase that the universe is observer created. That was thought-provoking. The physicist Max Planck said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. At that moment, it occurred to me that most of what I thought I was so sure of, everything I thought I knew about what substance is, what holds everything together, might just be an assumption, and a false one at that. And seeing as I had a little time on my hands, I thought, I'm going to do an inventory of all my assumptions. And if I haven't proven something true in my own experience, I'm just going to let that go, and I'll see where that takes me. And the process, it was like peeling a giant onion. And the assumptions and the beliefs and the opinions are falling. And I'm starting to wonder if there will be anything left. But when everything else had fallen away, there was something left. And it was something I knew was true. It was something I knew in the core of my being was true. And it was love. And I don't mean I was remembering past incidents of affection or thinking abstractly about love. This was a sense of love. It was like looking out from a love that was poured out on everything. If I turned my head and looked out the window, it was there. If I looked out the door of the room, it was there. It was a sense of a love that cares for us, that provides for us, that is always there, always has been there, always will be there. And this sense of life as inseparable from that love brought such a wash of relief that I fell asleep. Well, when I woke up in the morning, I knew right away something was different. For one thing, the fever was gone. And I didn't know it yet, but all of those physical problems were gone. I knew I felt full of joy and energy. And there was something sweetly familiar about this feeling. And I realized, what kind of a start, what it was, that this was exactly how I'd felt as a child when I'd been healed in Christian Science. And I thought, what happened last night? What was I thinking? I remembered just before bed, I had opened a book about the early centuries of Christianity. I had not thought about Christianity in years, but a friend had given me this scholarly account. And it was about the lives of the men and women who were there at the start of the Christian movement, how their lives were transformed. And I realized that whatever any of my friends might want to say about whether or not you could prove there was a historical Jesus, something big had happened at this moment, something huge and world transforming. I remembered thinking about Max Planck and looking at the wall across from my bed and reasoning, all right, it's matter, and matter is composed of atoms, and atoms are mostly empty space, and the empty space is filled with consciousness. So surely the question has got to be, what is this consciousness that can form and transform reality? And as soon as that question had formed, the answer came, and it came to me in words I'd learned in Sunday school from something called the scientific statement of being, which you hear in Christian Science churches every Sunday. It says, there is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter. All is infinite mind, and its infinite manifestation, for God is all in all. Well, that pretty much rocketed me out of bed. And I ran into the living room and I got a chair and I climbed up to the top of the bookshelf where I had stuck my childhood copy of Science and Health, and I pulled it down and I blew off the dust and I started reading. There were the answers to the questions I've been asking for 15 years. What is really going on here? Well, there is a divine principle to the universe, and it is love. And I just seen that. Who am I? I'm inseparable from that love. And I just felt that. What am I here for? I must be here to share it. I must be here to express it. And on the heels of that came a thought that was really surprising, and it was, I want to go to church. I didn't really know what that was about, but Sunday came and I went to church and I sat in the back and I waited to see what would happen. 3 lines into the first hymn, I feel tears rolling down my cheeks, because here again is that amazing sense of love. And the hymn that morning was from a poem by Mary Baker Eddy that starts, "Oh, gentle presence, peace and joy and power. Oh, life divine that owns each waiting hour." Everything I heard at the service that morning, it just affirmed and explained and magnified that sense of love, so that when I walked out the door at the end of the service, I knew what I had to do. I had to hang on to this sense of things. I did not want to let it go. I had to find a way to live consistently with it and from it, and I wanted to share it. Now, it turns out that response is not exceptional in any way. It turns out whenever anybody catches a glimpse of the reality of this love, they have exactly the same response. They feel joy and gratitude. They want to hang on to it, and they want to share it. And you see this in the experience of those first Christians. People encountered first through Jesus, then through his followers, this completely different way of thinking, this amazing paradigm shift that St. Paul called the mind of Christ. And what is Christ? Christ is divine truth. It's God's love coming to us, showing us the good that's there to be seen, clearing out our fears, healing us. If you want to see what Christ looks like in human experience, you look at the life of Christ Jesus, right? Everything he said, everything he did expressed Christ. So there's St. Paul urging his fellow Christians to have that mind, the mind that was in Christ Jesus, implying, first of all, that we can have the understanding that lay behind Jesus' teachings and his healing works, that we can do those healing works as he promised his followers that they could, through this understanding. And people responded with joy, with enthusiasm, with boldness. There was a young woman in Iconium, Turkey named Thekla. And when Paul came there to preach, Thekla sat in the window of her family home and listened. 3 days Paul preached, 3 days Thekla sat in the window, and then she went out the door, leaving behind the life that her parents had expected her to lead. She became a follower of Paul, then a partner in his ministry in Turkey. And she is just one of the many men and women who responded to that Christ message, who dropped everything and went around the Mediterranean basin sharing that message, healing. And there's more and more documentation of that healing now. Before a brick was ever laid in a church building, there was this movement of personal transformation, of people responding to Christ. It was like a stone had been dropped in a pond. And the stone was this understanding of love. And the ripples went out. That was church. You know, that word we read as church in our English Bibles. In the original Greek of the Gospels, that word was ekklesia. It only shows up twice in the Gospels. And at the time, ekklesia simply meant people who were called or summoned together. It could be for anything. Well, the really definitive place where you find it is where Jesus asks his disciples to tell him who they think he is. And the disciple Simon answers, and he says, "You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God." And Jesus agrees. And he says, "You are Peter," making wordplay on the Greek word petros for stone or rock. He says, "On this rock I will build my ekklesia." So Jesus' church, the men and women his words and works had called and summoned, had as their foundation the recognition of Christ, God's truth and love coming to us, showing us we are inseparable from the life that is God. So now I understand why my own little experience of love as a law of being should have prompted a desire for church. The recognition of love includes this call of the Christian ecclesia to rejoice in a spiritual sense of life, to strive to live with it and from it and to share it. I hope it's becoming clear why this church that we're talking about could never be in decline. And I think we're living at a particularly interesting moment right now, because when life gets challenging, when things get difficult, when life gets hard, it seems like that spiritual yearning will surface. And in the past couple of months, I've been reading news reports saying that statistics show that the decline in church that we've heard so much about for the past 10 or 15 years has stopped. And it's a global phenomenon. There was a piece about it in the New York Times last month. And the writer, let me just get this quote right. The writer describes a great spiritual yearning in the populace, which the religious institutions have not yet risen to meet. So this is a moment for church, the way we've been talking about it. Because what meets that spiritual yearning, it resists institutionalization, as we commonly think of the word. But that desire for a deeper, truer understanding of life than you can find in material conditions or theories about those conditions, that desire does not go unanswered. And you see this in the discovery and founding of Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy had that yearning. Now, she was born in 1821 in a New Hampshire farming community. Her family, in her words, were of Puritan stock. What does that mean? It means that these were people who earnestly believed that fulfilling one's duty to God was the entire purpose of existence. So that's the atmosphere she grows up in. She was certainly really uniquely fitted to make this discovery. She had great faith in God, a great love of God as a child. See, they're programmed at the factory to go off at moments of spiritual inspiration. And her faith and love for God was seen in occasions when she was actually able to help and heal others by lifting her thought to God in prayer. So when her older brother George accidentally gashed his leg open with an axe, her father brought Mary to him, and the wound healed so quickly it startled their family physician. But as a child and then as an adult, she suffered from chronic illness, and she knew that there must be more to understand about the nature of God than could be found in her father's Calvinist doctrine. There must be more to understand about the basis of well-being. And so she spent decades searching for answers to this. She studied allopathic medicine, Western medicine with a licensed physician. She studied homeopathy. She experimented with different health cures of her day. And what all of this showed her is that thought is definitely related to, if not entirely responsible for our experience. I mean, today a doctor will tell a patient, be hopeful. It's good to be optimistic, to think positive, because they know thought matters. But for her, given her experiences with prayer, she knew the thought needed was not a phase of human psychology. The thought that heals is the thought from God. And so all during those decades, the Bible was her closest friend, her constant companion, her go-to place to get a deeper, clearer sense of what was really going on. Now, for me, it's that steadfast faith that has been such a helpful model. Because as somebody, I mean, let's face it, I caught a really good look at the power of spirit as a small child, and then I completely lost it. And it has since made me appreciate not leaving God out of your calculations, which is something she never did. So this brings us to 1866, and she is at a low point. Her pastor, her doctor, her friends are expecting her to pass on at any moment. And she turns to her Bible, and it opens to one of Jesus' healings. She becomes suddenly well. And then something happens that I think is as important to the discovery. And what happens is this fresh, new, old understanding, this paradigm shift, this different way to think that starts with love, met with resistance. And the resistance appeared in the person of her doctor. And when she welcomed him, fully dressed and in apparent good health and rejoicing in her good health, his reaction was to tell her, "You can't possibly be well." The severity of the internal injuries that she suffered, he says, make this kind of recovery impossible. And because he had diagnosed her at the time as having had a concussion, he questioned her. "Did you take the medication that I left for you?" "No, it's here in a drawer. I never touched it." And then he began to explain to her in the kind of physiological detail she would have understood exactly why she could not have become well so fast. And as he's doing this, she feels the symptoms coming back. She feels weak. She feels faint. And seeing this, he gets her settled in a chair. And then because there isn't anything else he can do for her medically, he wishes her well, and he leaves. She goes back to her Bible. And again, it opens to one of Jesus' healings, and she finds there what she later described as the living, palpitating presence of Christ. and the relapse ends. So it's these two factors. It's that recognition of the power and presence of God's love, good for all time, and the fact that the human mind has got to yield to the divine mind. That these assumptions and opinions, the condemnations, have to be cleared away to make room for the mind of Christ. And you see those same two factors at work in the early Christian experience, because of course the early Christians faced appalling resistance and adversity. They faced persecution and imprisonment and execution, and their response to these existential threats was prayer. And I think it's safe to assume that their prayer would have been based in what Jesus had taught them about the power and ever-presence of God as love, that there would be no room they would ever find themselves in where this love was not the biggest thing, was not the only thing that they would ever need to consider. So when Paul is preaching in Lystra, in Turkey, and a mob turns against him, and they stone him, and they drag his body out of the city gates, and they leave it for dead. His fellow Christians come, and they pray, but I want to stop there for a minute and just consider with me for a second what that would have involved. Who were those people? Some of them had been traveling with Paul, undoubtedly, on his mission. Perhaps some of them were new. They had heard him preach. They had heard that Christ message, and now they were starting from this different place. But whether they were new or whether they'd been with him, they all did the same thing, which was they didn't dive for cover. They also didn't stop and fall to their knees and cry, "Oh Lord, why did you let this terrible thing happen? How could you let Paul die?" They didn't blame Paul. They didn't say, "Well, I guess his faith just wasn't strong enough." They didn't blame themselves. They didn't say, "We should have been there if we'd done something different, if only." None of that happened. They went and gathered around him and prayed, and Paul got up and he went back to preaching. It is this kind of prayer that is the reason that the book where you read the accounts of the first 30 or 40 years of the Christian record, the book of Acts, it's the reason that book is not called the book of the terrible times and the horrible things we suffered. It's called the Acts of the Apostles, and it's a book full of grace and healing and revelation. Now, when Mary Baker Eddy described her own experiences with adversity, she called them God's gracious preparation. And she did not mean that God sends or intends adversity, but rather that when we, like those early Christians, turn with hope and faith in the reality of God's present goodness, we're going to have a different experience. We're going to find that adversity is not a proof of God's absence. Adversity is just another occasion in which we can find love's presence. And we will do this not through willpower, not through the so-called power of positive thinking. The human mind has nothing to do with this. We will make our own proofs of love's presence and care when our God-given love of good welcomes the Christ. And that's the methodology of Christian Science. That's the how-to. I have a friend, he liked to say that the words Christian and science are like a match and a stick of dynamite. You keep them apart, nothing happens. But you put together what Jesus knew about the nature of God as always present, all-powerful love, good for all time, with the fact that this is a universal truth, available to anyone, anywhere, anytime, and something huge happens. And I'm not talking about a destructive explosion. I'm talking about a powerful disruption of fear, of sorrow, of anger, where that merely material, coldly conventional sense of things gets blown away. And you see yourself and everything in the light of spirit, whole and intact and blessed and blessing. Now that's the paradigm shift that will enable mankind to survive and move toward higher levels. So how do we do that? Well, this is what church has to do with it. When Mary Baker Eddy began to share her discovery, teach Christian healing, she saw very quickly the hearts and minds of her students had to be prepared to receive that message. There were some early students who were not prepared. They saw what she was doing as a business opportunity for themselves. And those students fell away. But as her ecclesia grew, she created a church manual and bylaws that were designed to turn its members to God for everything. Not just in the running of the organization, but in how to live our lives every day. The mind of Christ should have precedence. She saw that church, understood and participated in as what God is doing with us, that church would prove the practicality of Jesus' teachings. It would show how normal and natural it is for us to live this way. It would, in her words, reinstate primitive Christianity and its lost element of healing. You hear this in her own description of church and science and health. She says, church, the structure of truth and love, whatever rests upon and proceeds from divine principle. And I think it's helpful to know that in the dictionary that she would have grown up with, the most popular dictionary of her youth was the 1828 Webster's. The first meaning of the word structure is not a noun. It's almost a verb. It says structure, the act of building. She goes on, the church is that institution which affords proof of its utility and is found elevating the race, rousing the dormant understanding from material beliefs to the apprehension of spiritual ideas and the demonstration of divine science, thereby casting out devils or error and healing the sick. And again, if you look at that 1828 Webster's, the first meaning of institution is another almost verb. It says institution, the act of establishing. So this church is truth and love's act of building. It is God's act of establishing. It's a place where there's an ongoing up-leveling of our understanding of life through inspiration that we share, through the revelations that we have, through our putting those into practice. I mean, you go into a Christian Science church on a Wednesday evening and you will hear people talk about what has happened to them when they started from this different basis. And you'll hear about healing, because healing is a side effect of the mind of Christ. I'll share this experience from my own branch church. On a Wednesday evening a few years back, we had all come to church at a time when the town was very concerned about wildfires. The air was so thick with smoke you couldn't see to the end of our church driveway 50 feet away. And before the service, the meeting, we stood under the portal and we talked about animals that had to be rescued and livestock that needed to get out of the way and homes that were at risk. And then we went to church. And the first reader, the person who puts together on Wednesday readings from the Bible and Science and Health, because those books are our pastor, had put together readings about God's protection in times of danger. There's lots of stories about that in the Bible. And then people stood up and shared their own experiences of God's protection in dangerous moments. We were all remembering together that this is how it works. So by the time we left, that anxiety and concern was gone, and what had replaced it was just a clear sense of love's presence and the power of that. Well, the next Wednesday, a man came back who had been there the week before. He wasn't a member, he was visiting. His family had a cabin in the Pecos, which had been in their family for over a century, and that was right where the worst of the fires were. And he said he had been glued to his radio because you could get updates about every 15 minutes on what was burning down. Well, the fires had been put out in a matter of days. And so a friend of his was able to get up and see where the cabin had been. And there was no real hope that there was anything there. But the friend called him on his mobile and said, "It's a miracle. Your cabin is intact. You can see where the fire came down one side and it turned, and then it jumped a creek in front and it turned. There's a ring around your cabin, man. It's a miracle." And the man said to us he knew it was not a miracle. It was a proof of everything that he had heard at that meeting. Because when he went home, he decided, I'm going to turn that radio off. Instead of listening to what the fire's doing, I'm going to think about what God is doing. Just like those people. And that's exactly what he did. So I share that not only because it's a wonderful example of how you could be faced with something that seems insurmountable, whether it's man-made or natural, something that seems completely beyond your control or ability to do anything about. And by starting from this different basis, you can have a different experience. But I also share it because, thank heaven we were there. We came to church that night instead of doing other things, instead of going home and monitoring on Zoom. We were there and able to share that inspiration, and it made such a difference. So I said at the beginning that my experience had given me hope. Hope about surviving and moving to those higher levels. And I know how challenging that is. I mean, we live in an age of 24/7 news, which is like standing in front of a fire hose of reasons to be sad and mad and scared. And I know from my own experience how easy it is to get distracted. But what my experience showed me, what I find in the teachings of Christ Jesus, what I find in the writings of Mary Baker Eddy, is that dark, grim picture of the world and of us, that's not the whole picture. In fact, because it leaves God out, it's not the true picture at all. And we actually can find love's presence and that practical goodness. So I want to close by sharing with you 2 examples of what that can look like in everyday life. And the first is what church can look like. So when I came back to church, our church wanted to rewrite their bylaws. So we had a business meeting and we all sat in a circle, and it became quickly apparent that there were as many opinions about what the new bylaws are supposed to look like as there were people in the room. It was not our finest hour. Harsh words were spoken. People left unhappy. As unhappy as we were at the end of that evening, I knew we were going to go home and pray. And our prayer wasn't going to be, please, dear Lord, make them agree with me. It would be a prayer of listening. So during the 3 months that we had before the next business meeting when we would vote on various motions, I decided I would do a kind of deep dive into what the early Christians thought about their church. And I remembered Paul telling those first Christians at Corinth, he said, "You are the temple of the living God." In other words, it's not a building, it's you. And then he said the church was the body of Christ. Right? That means we are all indispensable, invaluable parts of this greater whole that expresses God's truth and love. That's our real identity. And then I found this in the letters of Peter. This is from 2 Peter. And I think the King James English on this is fantastic because he's writing to people who have had this experience. And he says, "Ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious. Ye as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, acceptable to God." So when we came together and the votes were held, every vote was unanimous. And you could see people looking around them at their fellow members because people were voting contrary to the opinions they had held forth for those prior 3 months vociferously. When we talked about it afterward, everybody said the same two things. They talked about the love they'd felt in that room, and they talked about the fact that when they got there, they decided they were going to listen. They really did want to know what God had to say. And as they heard, they voted. And then there we were, all of one accord in one place, like it says in the book of Acts. I mean, who would have thought? And I share that because it's not just true about church. That if you can start from that different basis, that true basis of God being in charge of everything and us being God's expression, and that is real identity and real power, you can have a very different experience. So just a few weeks ago, I got an email from someone at a church where I had lectured, and they were part of a homeowners association. I don't know if you have anything like that here, but if you have a condo, well, there's nothing more difficult than a homeowners association. But they had taken this idea and tried it at their meeting, which had been very contentious, and they said it was the most amazing thing because they were able to find solutions. So maybe you're in some human community that is trying to find solutions and you can't agree on what the solutions are. Maybe you can't agree what the problem is. You can start from this different basis and have a different experience, all of us. The last illustration is about being a living stone. So when I would attend church in Wisconsin, where I lived for 16 years, we had a church member who used to get up every Wednesday evening, such enthusiasm. She would talk about what she was gaining from reading the Bible lesson sermon. So in a Christian Science church, you come to church on Sunday, there's a sermon that's read from Science and Health from the Bible. No matter what Christian Science church you go into, it's the same topic. But it's not a surprise because we get to see it beforehand. And so Barb said she would read that week's sermon on Monday, and then she would take it out for a test drive on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, she would come and share how that was going. So on this particular Wednesday, she stood up and said she'd been taking out her trash when a neighbor came over and asked if she would pray. She knew Barb was a praying person. She said, "Would you pray for my husband? He's in the hospital. He has stage 4 cancer. They don't think he's going to live out the week." And Barb said, "Of course I'll pray." She went back to her house and she thought, "I'm going to read this week's Bible lesson sermon again, and I'm going to apply what I find there to not just me here in my living room, but to my neighbor, to her husband." And she said she had to read it 3 times before she saw very clearly that this applied to everyone. And by the time she was done describing it to us, we all felt it too. Well, the next Wednesday, Barb came back and said she'd been taking out her trash when there was her neighbor's husband taking out their trash. And she hurried over, told him how glad she was to see him. And he said, I've never been so happy to take out the trash in my life. But that the Thursday before, right after she'd started praying, doctors had ordered another round of tests for no apparent reason. And when the results came back, they showed that the cancer was gone. So some very happy doctors sent this very happy man and his wife home. And I share that because those glimpses you get in your living room, when you're taking a walk, when you're driving to work and thinking about what God is doing, they're not just nice thoughts. They're glimpses of reality. And you should grab them with both hands and not let them go. Make them your touchstone for the day. Cherish them. Because truly, as you change your basis, you change the world. And you live as the place where God is seen and felt. I want to thank you all very much again for coming out this evening.